right, you guys, welcome back to another episode of Freedom Papers, powered by Turning Point USA, hosted by me, Morgan Zegers, your favorite little history nerd host. Hello, and grandmother. Speaking of grandmother tendencies, I mentioned this last time. AmpFest is coming up, and Morgan never goes to parties, but Morgan's going to this party, so I better see you there. I found out from the higher-ups at HQ, because sometimes I meander the halls at HQ. I found out that I could get a code for AmpFest for you guys to use, anybody that listens to Freedom Papers. If you use the code Morgan, you get 25% off your ticket to AmpFest. That's happening at the end of December, right before Christmas. It's April, what am I doing? I have AmpFest in my head. It's December 18th through 21. And it's going to be big conservative speakers like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson. I'm super excited about that. I love Tucker. But also country music artists. And that's where I'm like, all right, now you're really piquing my interest because I'm a country bumpkin. I like old school country music, but hey, I'll go to this and put up with these new country guys. Maybe we'll get some new announcements of even more singers. But like Brantley Gilbert's going to be there and Ray Lynn, and I'm just super excited. So I never go out to this kind of stuff, but Grandma's going out for this one. Use code Morgan to join me there and get your ticket 25% off with code Morgan. Go do it right now at tpusa.com/AmericaFest. Okay, I feel like President Donald Trump when I say that, /AmericaFest. Okay, that being said, other call to action, if you don't follow the Instagram page yet, what are you doing with your life? Okay, go to Freedom Papers Podcast, at Freedom Papers Podcast on Instagram, because it's where I post all the little behind-the-scenes stuff and little highlights and clips of the podcast and all the fun things. So I run that page. I asked Turning Point if I could make that because I was like, I want a little home for our community that we're growing. So go follow that, and you can literally DM me, and I'll probably reply. I'm a terrible messenger, so I don't want to make that promise. But that being said, go find that on Instagram, Freedom Papers Podcast, and definitely get your tickets to AmericaFest here in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, we're getting into paper number 6, Federalist paper number 6, and this is a spicy one. Okay, it's called Concerning Dangers from Dissensions Between States, and it's written by the one and only Alexander Hamilton, of course, under the pen name Publius. This episode, we're going to do a quick recap. We're going to go through papers 2 through 5 because we have left that section, people. Okay, we did that entire section already. I can't believe it. We're moving forward so much as a little educational community. We're moving out of papers 2 through 5, which had to do with foreign affairs, concerning dangers from foreign force and influence. And those were the only papers written by John Jay. We're going to do a little recap on those. And then today's topic is about preventing hostilities between us, the American states or potential confederacies on American soil. What are we going to do to make sure we don't start infighting? Now, the topics in the paper, I figured it would be best for us to look at Federalist, Anti-Federalist, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, Federalist, Anti-Federalist. And we're going to go back and forth this episode because it just seems like the best. This was one of those papers where they get really, sassy in the back and forth here. So I want you guys to really be able to see what was one saying, what was the other saying, what was one saying, what was the other saying. Some of the topics include, just in general, are small countries that are close to each other going to end up fighting? Or are they going to end up being allies? And why would they end up fighting? Or why would they end up being allies? Then the Federalist paper really breaks down the multiple causes of hostilities between nations and makes the case for, that's exactly why we have to be aware of this and be united. And then towards the end, they talk about, well, if we are close together, wouldn't we have more financial incentive to work together and to be allies, especially when it comes to commerce, than we would to fight? And honestly, the Anti-Federalists are like, who gives a crap? We just don't want to have tyranny at our door with the U.S. Constitution because they hated the document and they thought that it would bring despotism, and we'll talk about that. But they were like, who cares if we go to civil war? Who cares if we end up fighting? We don't care. We just don't want to have this terrible document called the U.S. Constitution implemented. Ew. And then the Federalists were like, have you not seen history? Small countries will end up fighting each other, and we need to prevent that from happening on our soil. We would be stronger together because history has proven time and time again, and that's what Federalist Paper number 6 is really about, referencing multiple situations, specifically between Athens and Greece, or specifically between Athens and Sparta in Greece, and multiple other situations. So it's definitely a very history-nerdy episode, and I can't wait to get started. That being said, let's get on to a quick recap of, remember you guys, we are in part 1 the Union. There's two parts to the Federalist Papers. The part one is the Union making the case for why we're stronger together. Part two is when we like to have guests on the episodes, the guests on the podcast, and that's more about breaking down the actual structure of government with the U.S. Constitution and the kind of government that we would have if we voted to ratify back in 1787. So papers 2 through 5 were the only I'm going crazy, the only papers written by John Jay. Paper number 2, remember, paper number 2 is Morgan's favorite, one of Morgan's favorites, and it's because it's beautiful. It's saying we just won a Revolutionary War. What the heck are we doing trying to split up now? And he says, this land, the beautiful, fertile land of the United States of America, or what would become it, and the navigable waters, the fertile soil, this land was brought together with the people of America, the freedom-seeking people of America, with a very unique and unprecedented mindset of, oh my gosh, we can make a government of, by, and for the people. We were brought together by providence, and that means by God's hand, basically. It's just beautiful. So it's definitely more of a prettier essay. It's not really technical. It just really pulls at the heartstrings. It's one of my favorites. Paper number 3 says, listen, when there's a bunch of us dealing with other countries, a bunch of little tiny entities on our soil dealing with other countries, it means there's that many more chances of one of those relationships with a foreign country turning sour, turning to animosity, and turning to violence. We would be stronger if we were all one united front on the international stage, making and doing our own work as one entity, and that really kind of mitigates the risks of having a bunch of bad relationships or any foul play going on. Paper number 4 then gets into, okay, so not only that do we have to worry about like just dealing with potential wars between all the different little entities or confederacies or states with the other countries, but as we grow our economy, we are not dependent on those countries anymore. We're actually becoming their economic competition. And that opens us up to potential attacks too, because then they're going to start getting jealous of us. And so how do we go to the negotiating table and enter the international economy with a strong arm? And it would be best done if we were all one united country. So making the case for more of the economic reasons why we're stronger on the international stage. Paper number 5, which we did last episode, is basically saying, listen, if we are small confederacies, if we are 3 or 4 small confederacies, we are not going to act like brotherly allies. We are not going to act like neighbors. Instead, we will see each other as borderers only, and history proves that. What they specifically did is did a case study on Europe, Great Britain, the joining of England and Scotland, and how those countries existed together near each other, small, for so long, and they never united. So why would we look and say, wow, that's a good example for us to follow? Not only that, but paper number 5 then finishes and says, the whole international community has their own self-interest. And what do you think they're going to do if they want to get onto our soil and they have their own self-interest and they want to exploit our resources, our materials, or us? They're going to offer to help us as we have our little infighting and our little wars against each other. And they're just going to exploit us and use us for their own advantage. And what I specifically looked at last episode was about what goes on in the Middle East today. The international community, China, America, Russia, we're all involved in the Middle East. And it's basically for our own personal desires and for our own personal advantage. It really has nothing to do with helping the people there, and it's a shame, but whatever. All right, but getting into paper number 6, though, so it kind of takes that same theme of paper number 5, but paper number 5 had that international view. Now we're going to look at it from just a domestic view. Why are we going to be stronger together if we are united and not multiple little confederacies on the same soil? Paper number 6 is titled Concerning Dangers from Dissensions Between the States. And again, you guys, it's written by Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton carries on the same theme, though, into paper number 7. So this is part 1 of 2 of the same theme concerning dangers from dissensions between the states. Now, let's get into the first discussion point. Basically, paper number 6, Federalist paper number 6, is filled with very pretty words. And I'm going to read a few of them for you right now, but you're going to basically see that Federalist paper pulls at the heartstrings on this a lot and references historical moments. It's this beautiful combination of historical lessons and how we can be united together on one strong front. And the Anti-Federalists come in and reply to this and they say, listen, your pretty words don't really mean anything and we don't really care how pretty you make it sound. We still don't want the Constitution. So we're going to look at this back and forth here. But first, we are going to start with what the Federalists said. They basically said, if you think we're going to get along without incentive to coordinate, and by that incentive, by that I mean the Union, then you clearly have not read history, you Anti-Federalists. And so it's kind of like the insult that we have today in America, where we look at the socialists and they're like, oh yeah, socialism would work one more time if we tried it. The Federalists were saying that to the Anti-Federalists of like, have you not read history? Have you not learned anything from history? We are not going to get along if we split up and become bordering confederacies. So the Federalist opens up by saying, quote, "A man must be far gone in utopian speculations who can seriously doubt that if these states should either be wholly disunited or only united in partial confederacies, the subdivisions into which they might be thrown would have frequent and violent contests with each other. To presume a want of motives for such contests as an argument against their existence would be to forget that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious." Oh, so you see what I mean there? They are starting right from the bat. They are attacking the Anti-Federalists, saying you have no idea what you're talking about if you are able to look at history and say, there's going to be no problems with us having no reason to coordinate or no incentive to coordinate. They then say, to look for a continuation of harmony between a number of independent, unconnected sovereignties situated in the same neighborhood would be to disregard the uniform course of human events and to set at defiance the accumulated experience of ages. Ugh, you guys, this is intense right from the start, and I felt it as I was reading, but what's even cooler is to look and see what the Anti-Federalists were saying. Before we see what they said, though, what I'm getting here is, again, that constant, like, honey, go open a history textbook that we get from a lot of the people in the conservative movement today when we look at all of the history of the 20th century. That being said, though, when we think of why would the Anti-Federalists be so naive to assume that people are just going to want to get along? Let's look at some moments of history. Now, I was recently, I brought this up on the last episode, I was watching this documentary and I'm reading this book about Genghis Khan and the history of Korea, because basically when it comes to Afghanistan right now, a lot of people say that what happened in Afghanistan should have been something that looks a lot like what happened between North Korea and South Korea, where we made a safe space for the people to be in South Korea, and then we said, okay, you can have your crazy land, whatever, that's how it ended, but at least there was that 38th parallel, and it stopped the oppression of the people in that country, and they could at least be free in South Korea. And now look at the differences between those two countries. People are very disappointed because they say right now, a lot of our military experts, they say that what happened in Afghanistan should have looked something like what happened in North Korea, because there's no stopping these extremists, okay? There's no fully getting rid of them. But we could have at least done something better for the people of Afghanistan than what happened with Biden just pulling us out. That being said, I was looking at the history of Korea and how they got to that moment of this one communist area of now North Korea and then capitalist South Korea, and it's pretty fascinating. But part of that history is Genghis Khan and the Mongols and all that stuff, and it reminded me of one of their stories, reading this, of the Anti-Federalists just assuming that people are going to have the incentive to stay together. It's like there's really no reason to do it. And Genghis Khan, it turns out that him and his childhood friend, they became blood brothers, and in their heritage, in their culture, becoming blood brothers and doing this ritual when they were children was like the ultimate sign of commitment. And even Genghis Khan was betrayed. His childhood friend, guess what? Even though they made the ultimate sign of commitment, they shook hands, they cut their hands, and then they combined their blood, whatever. His friend grew up and they had their little tribes together, and his friend was just so desirous of power that he said, I'm going to break this bond with my blood brother and start conquering the world. And I'm going to end this tie with my neighbor, with my friend that I grew up with my entire life, because I am hungry for power and I want to conquer the world. And Genghis Khan was like, I don't really want to do that. Why do you have to ruin this? And it turns out Genghis Khan's wife was like, let him go, honey. Let him go off on his own. I see this ending badly anyways. So if you look at Genghis Khan, what he ended up turning into, he was just a guy, like a local leader with his ally, his best friend, and then his best friend had this desire for power and blood, and it led to them splitting, it led to them breaking this serious bond that they have. So if you can't even keep the ultimate sign of commitment together for life in that aspect, in those small reasons, why should countries that are on American soil just say, you know what, let's never fight, let's always be friends because we're close to each other and we're brothers and we're on the same soil of America. It's never going to turn bad. Another example, what are some other reasons of humans being just terrible and bloodthirsty? Not bloodthirsty, I shouldn't say that, but aggressive with each other unnecessarily. Mary, Queen of Scots. I'm obsessed with this story. I brought it up earlier. The Tudor dynasty really gets me going. Love talking about it. But if you guys don't know this, Mary, Queen of Scots, and her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, were both queens. One was Queen of Scotland, one was Queen of England. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots, thought that she should be Queen of England as well. So they were constantly growing up and coming of age and knowing that they were going at it with each other, but they never fought. Queen Elizabeth was worried that Mary, Queen of Scots, was going to take her throne. So eventually, this accumulated so much that a first cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, beheaded her own cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, just to protect her throne. So you have this infighting between these two countries run by cousins because they couldn't get rid of their desire for power. They couldn't stop themselves. They had problems as humans. And they did not unite until Mary, Queen of Scots, was dead, Queen Elizabeth was dead, and it turns out Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James, becomes King of England and Scotland because guess what? Queen Elizabeth I died without an heir. And so then Mary's son becomes the king of both lands and they unite eventually. And it's a whole story. But it's just two good examples, and that's what Publius is talking about of like, why are we going to assume that unconnected sovereignties are going to act like neighbors when history has proven that history is pretty bloody and humans can be pretty negative towards each other? So those are just two of my favorite examples from history. But the Anti-Federalists, they hit back, okay? They hit back, and they said something like this. They said, quote, "The evils of anarchy have portrayed with all the imagery of language in the growing colors of eloquence. The affrighted mind is thence led to clasp the new constitution as the instrument of deliverance, as the only avenue to safety and to happiness." And if we put that into more simple words, what he's saying basically is, okay, our opponents, the Federalists, are just using pretty words to try and scare you into thinking that the Constitution is the only way to prevent civil war and massive war and infighting. Don't believe them, okay? Do not believe them. And so that's why they're saying that they're scaring you into thinking the Constitution is the only way to lock in your safety and happiness. The Anti-Federalists think that there's a better way. The next topic is there's a lot of things that could lead to hostility. Here are just a few categories. And again, we're going to get into some historical examples that the founders looked to as they were writing the Constitution and as the Federalists were making the case for why we need to ratify it. Okay, so he gives three different buckets, basically, of different causes of hostility. The first bucket, the first theme of hostility causes is that there's a bunch of them that are just constant in all of human societies. All of mankind falls victim to these constant causes of hostility. They say that there are some that pretty much are never going away. Okay, no matter what we do, they're never going away. And he says, quote, "The love of power or the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power or the desire of equality and safety." What he's saying there is one of those constant causes for hostility is going to be that bad people are always going to want to gain power and oppress others. The other reason for the cause of hostility is that humans that are oppressed and don't have freedom will always desire and want and fight for freedom. A desire to fight for free will. And I think we see that a lot in America today. Okay, we're finally not experiencing free will, and it's a first for a lot of us Americans. We're saying, wow, it's time to stand up and fight for something in our lives and have dignity and put our foot down and draw the line. But those two reasons that are constant throughout human society is that bad people will want to rise up and oppress others, and that two, good people that are being oppressed will constantly want to strive and fight for freedom. That's pretty powerful. The second theme, the second bucket of hostility causes, I should say, are circumstantial. And so other causes can be more nuanced and based on the circumstances of the time, of the country, of the relationship between countries. Publius says, quote, "such as the rivalships and competitions of commerce between commercial nations." So basically saying trade. He's saying economic purposes. He's saying similar to how in paper number 4, America is growing its economy and it's becoming competition to the world powers, and that can lead to some entanglements. He says, "There are others, not less numerous than either of the former, which take their origin entirely in private passions." He says personal reasons, okay? Personal character flaws, leadership failures, private, quote, "attachments, enmities, interests, hopes, and fears of leading individuals." So individual leaders have character flaws and make bad decisions. Publius says, quote, "Men of this class, whether the favorites of a king or of a people, have in too many instances abused the confidence they possessed, and assuming the pretext of some public motive, have not scrupled to sacrifice the national tranquility to personal advantage or personal gratification." He gives a couple examples, 2 examples that I really enjoyed in paper number 6. He says, Pericles' personal desires and interests led to him being a major influence in the start of the Peloponnesian War, okay, so between Sparta and Athens, which after quite some time led to the ruin of the Athenian Commonwealth. Ooh, that kind of sucks, doesn't it? I mean, imagine having the American founders blame you for starting a war like that. Okay, so what's so interesting is, I'm not going to read it out loud because it's definitely a longer paragraph, but Alexander Hamilton kind of goes at Pericles and he says, it could have been a bunch of reasons, all being put on Pericles' shoulders as the blame. He says, was it when he attacked and destroyed a city to please a prostitute? He says, was it when he caused more problems after trying to avoid getting busted for stealing? Was it when he stirred up more problems to avoid getting in trouble for dissipating funds of the state? Or was it all of them? Was it 2 of them of the 3? Was it 1 of them of the 3? Was it all 3 of them? Who knows? But Pericles was a flawed man, and it led to his country going to war. And then guess what? That war was so devastating that it led to the end of the Athenian Commonwealth. Ugh, that's not something you want Alexander Hamilton to put on your shoulders. But he blames the flaws of a single man, the inappropriate, immature, and selfish decisions of one single man led to potentially the end of the Athenian Commonwealth. Yikes. Another example, and again, Tudor Dynasty, here I go. If you haven't seen The Tudors on Netflix. I'm not usually a Netflix fan. I don't watch it anymore, so maybe I shouldn't pitch this. But the Tudor show is really good. Now, Cardinal Woolsey, he was a cardinal in the church, and he was basically two-timing, okay? So he's supposed to be serving King Henry VIII, and instead he's going behind King Henry VIII's back to please King Charles. Why would he do that? Because he wanted to get more power. He saw personal advantage in pleasing Charles, and so he kept trying to egg King Henry VIII on to go to war with France. Why? Why cause a war just to get a little more power? Because he was flawed. He was a bad man, and he had too much power, and his individual decisions led to a bunch of people suffering for that. And so that's another example that Hamilton brings up in the Federalist paper, trying to make the case for why America would be stronger together. Because he says, look at when these little countries, when people rise up and have a little too much power in these smaller entities, they end up fighting over stupid crap. Now, what I thought was also interesting is Hamilton does a little dig at men that end up causing problems between nations, conflict between nations, over women, over desires for women. And that's just a little spicy thing that I wanted to add in there. But it's interesting that he said men have also caused people to hurt and die because they just had desires for women and fought about women. And that's ridiculous, is basically what he says. The other thing, though, is he then says, and look at what has happened here on American soil. He references the Shea's Rebellion. So basically, recap for everybody who isn't aware of Shea's Rebellion yet. Shea's Rebellion was a big proponent for why we should end the Articles of Confederation and adopt the U.S. Constitution. The Federalists used this as one of the big reasons for why we need a new form of government with one solid federal government, encouraging cooperation and utilization of combined resources. Basically, the economy was not doing good, and at the same time as the economy is failing, all of this bad economy, the super high taxes in Massachusetts, it led to farmers, it led to average men joining together, and they were led by Daniel Shays and other local leaders in Massachusetts. They got about 1,200 men to force the Supreme Court to adjourn, and it was all with a goal to stop foreclosures and debt processes that were taking place because of the bad economy. So what happened is the militia got sent in, they stopped Shea's Rebellion, but it led to legislative change that eased up on the debtors. And so, positive change was achieved on both sides there, where Shea's Rebellion and the violence was stopped by the militia. But also, Shea's Rebellion led to positive change in the sense of not attacking the debtors in such an aggressive way as the economy was failing. But Shea's Rebellion helped Federalists make the case for why we needed a national government to prevent skirmishes like this. And Hamilton brings it up, but he kind of attacks Shea's in an interesting way, saying that it was potentially his personal flaws as a man. And he says, quote, "A case has lately happened among ourselves. If Shea had not been a desperate debtor, it is much to be doubted whether Massachusetts would have plunged into civil war." And so he's saying, hey, this could be another example of a personal or private cause for hostility. Maybe if Shays didn't get himself in debt and become a desperate debtor, which I think is a little aggressive, then we wouldn't have had civil war in Massachusetts. So the Anti-Federalists, though, what the heck did they say? You see Hamilton in Federalist Paper number 6 blame potential private interests leading to hostilities. Guess what the Anti-Federalists said? They kind of used his own words against him. He said the Federalists are acting in their own delusive, self-interested, private ways. He said, this ought to teach us to depend more on our own judgment and the nature of the case than upon the opinions of the greatest and best of men who, from constitutional infirmities or particular situations, may sometimes view an object through a delusive medium. But the opinions of great men are more frequently the dictates of ambition or private interest. And so if you look at the full paper, and again, I encourage you guys all to read the papers, but Anti-Federalist number 6, they basically accuse the Federalists of saying, you guys are claiming that we need to be united because guys have private personal interests that lead to hostilities. Well, guess what? We think that by you advocating for the U.S. Constitution, you aren't thinking straight. You're supposed to be like the founders of America. We're all supposed to be the smartest, the greatest minds, and the leaders of this brand new country of, by, and for the people, an unprecedented concept. If we're supposed to be the smartest in the land, then why are you being so dumb right now advocating for that? And it's that aggressive if you read the paper. He's basically saying, you guys are acting in your own self-interest. You don't have our best interest in mind. And we think that this is about you having your own personal ambition and private interest. So using Hamilton's own accusations against himself. All right, next topic though. This is an interesting one. The Anti-Federalists think that financial incentive will encourage us to cooperate without a formal form of encouragement to cooperate. You get me? So they think that, I think this is a little naive of them, they think that we're all going to get along together because it would be in our best interest to do so. The Federalists disagree. Let's see what they both have to say. So the Federalists, they're basically saying even with all of these proven causes of hostility, the Anti-Federalists still insist that we will all get along because we will have financial incentive to do so. This is specifically what Federalist Paper number 6 says. Quote, "But notwithstanding the current testimony of experience, in this particular, there are still to be found visionary or designing men who stand ready to advocate the paradox of perpetual peace between the states, though dismembered and alienated from each other." So again, saying, these crazy guys are looking at history, looking at all these causes of potential hostility, and they still think, even though we don't have any formal reason to cooperate, we're all just going to get along, even though history proves that's not the case. So he goes on to say, "The genius of republics, say they, is pacific. The spirit of commerce has a tendency to soften the manners of men and to extinguish those inflammable humors which have so often kindled into wars. Commercial republics like ours will never be disposed to waste themselves in ruinous contentions with each other. They will be governed by mutual interest and will cultivate a spirit of mutual amity and concord." So Publius asked the Anti-Federalists good questions then. And again, what the Anti-Federalists have to say is yeah, we think that people would rely on their financial interests and say, the smarter thing isn't for us to fight, it's for us to align together and to achieve our similar goals financially, commerce-wise, economically. But again, history doesn't say that. So then what happens is the Federalist, Publius, starts to ask some legit questions. And this is something that I want to read out for you guys because it's pretty funny to read. "Is it not the true interest of all nations to cultivate the same benevolent and philosophic spirit?" So he's saying, isn't that the case for all is it really that often that people say they want bad things to happen? I mean, I think that's the case too. Not everybody out there, especially even the bad people that achieve bad things, do they set out saying, I want to ruin people's lives? No, they just have their own ambitions and it leads to people suffering. So again, Publius says, is it not the true interest of all nations to cultivate the same benevolent and philosophic spirit? Don't we all want to get along? I mean, come on. Obviously, we all want to get along, but is that the case of what happens? Publius says, if this be their true interest, have they in fact pursued it? Have they pursued it, though? It may be in their best interest, but does that mean they pursued it? Has it not, on the contrary, invariably been found that momentary passions and immediate interests have a more active and imperious control over human conduct than general or remote considerations of policy, utility, or justice? Ding, ding, ding! Have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies? Ooh, that's a good question. So he's saying there, even if we are this representative form of government, are you saying that we're going to be safer in any way? Because let's look at history again. Are not the former administered by men as well as the latter? So both monarchies and republics still run by men, just in different ways, but men are flawed, as we saw with the three buckets of causes for hostility. Are there not aversions, predilections, rivalships, and desires of unjust acquisitions that affect nations as well as kings? Are not popular assemblies frequently subject to the impulses of rage, resentment, jealousy, avarice, and of other irregular and violent propensities? Has commerce hitherto done anything more than change the objects of war? Is not the love of wealth as domineering and enterprising a passion as that of power or glory? Boom! That's a big one. Okay, so what he's saying, if the Anti-Federalists think that the desire for success in commerce and trade and the economy is going to continue to encourage us to stay together and united, hello, have you seen, again, human history? People fight over money all the time. A ton of wars are caused by trade. A ton of wars are caused by goods and competition in the economy. Are you kidding me? You think that if we have incentive to succeed financially, it would encourage us to align with each other instead of fighting each other so that we can beat each other in the economy? So, again, is not the love of wealth as domineering and enterprising a passion as that of power or glory? Can you think of a better quote to represent most of the conflicts in America between us and our people that we're fighting today, or worldwide, between countries and the people that they have conflicts with? Is it not pretty much always about money in some sort of way? I mean, come on, it's greed, it's money, it's power. Money and power are like two of the same things when you consider the causes of war. So money is not going to make us want to get along anymore. Continuing on, he says, have there not been as many wars founded upon commercial motives, since that has become the prevailing system of nations, as were before occasioned by the cupidity of territory or dominion? Has not the spirit of commerce in many instances administered new incentives to the appetite, both for the one and for the other? So he's saying, as we've progressed as a civilization, as the world has progressed into more industrial, we could say, because it's still only the 1700s. How much have we really achieved with technology at the time? But still so much since the previous centuries from what our founders were experiencing. Haven't the causes for war just gotten increased thanks to the new financial incentives that are caused by the growing economies of the world? Hello? So, again, he finishes, let experience, the least fallible guide of human opinions, be appealed to for an answer to these inquiries. And that's where we're going to get into some historical references by Hamilton, a really, really good section of this paper. So again, I'm going to read this one because it's just really, really good, and I want you guys to get the direct words from Hamilton on this because I just think it's so cool. We're looking to history now by reading these papers, but Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, our founders, and the Anti-Federalists, they were all doing the same thing but looking to the men who came before them centuries before. And that's what we're going to hear Hamilton talk about now. Hamilton says, Sparta, Athens, Rome, and Carthage were all republics. Two of them, Athens and Carthage, of the commercial kind. Sparta was little better than a well-regulated camp, and Rome was never sated of carnage and conquest. Carthage, though a commercial republic, was the aggressor in the very war that ended in her destruction. So, what he's saying there, Carthage was an advanced country focused on growing its economy and succeeding in commerce. But it got too aggressive as a commercial republic, and it got greedy, and it wanted more, and it started a war that ended with Carthage ending. It started a war that ended it. Hannibal had carried her arms into the heart of Italy and to the gates of Rome, before Scipio, in turn, gave him an overthrow in the territories of Carthage and made a conquest of the Commonwealth. Then he moves on to another example. In the government of Britain, the representatives of the people compose one branch of the national legislature. Commerce has been for ages the predominant pursuit of that country. Few nations, nevertheless, have been more frequently engaged in war, and the wars in which that kingdom has been engaged have, in numerous instances, proceeded from the people. And so he's attacking this on two ways here. One, for commerce, he's saying, what are you talking about? Britain's always been interested in succeeding in commerce, and that's literally why they attack people. It's literally why they get engaged in conflict. It's not why they ally with people. It's why they invade. It's why they take over. It's why they try and start wars and conflicts with people, because they want to succeed in commerce. He then also says, though, this is not something that we can just look at Britain and say, well, it's a monarchy. It's controlled by bad guys. It's controlled by a king. They're obviously going to be greedy. They aren't a good form of government. He's saying, look at, they had purposes to go to war that were caused by the people. It wasn't the king in many instances that said, you know what, I'm going to take all of my people and we're going to go to war against a country because I have personal desires. Instead, what Hamilton talks about is, he says, when you have two neighboring countries or two countries that don't like each other, it's the population that almost has the animosity for the other people in that country. And it made me think of like sports teams in America. I mean, look how aggressive people are. Ugh. Look how aggressive football team competitions are between like the fans. It's kind of insane. And that's how I saw it with like Great Britain versus other people. He's saying that this isn't just like the leaders of the country not liking each other or invading each other. That's not the cause for hostility in many situations. And many times it's actually caused by the people, the population. And then playing off of that concept that it's not just the style of government that can lead to hostilities. It can happen in republics too. It can happen caused by the people too. Publius says, there have been, if I may so express it, almost as many popular as royal wars. The cries of the nation and the importunities of their representatives have, upon various occasions, dragged their monarchs into war, or continued them in it, contrary to their inclinations, and sometimes contrary to the real interests of the state. What he's saying there, even though it's not in the country's best interest, even though the monarchs didn't even want to do it, the desire by the people, because of animosity that they had for the people of another nation, even though they were neighbors, even though they were technically touching and stuff like that, is what caused an entire war or hostilities or conflict or violence. And so we can't just say, well, we're going to be American, we're all going to be brotherly because we're all, freedom-seeking people and we're all going to have incentive to want to work together like the Anti-Federalists assumed. I think it's very naive for the Anti-Federalists to be saying this. That's where we get into the case study that Hamilton brings up between Spain and England specifically. And this is one of the last bigger things that I want to read for you guys as an example. But Hamilton says, the last war but two between Britain and Spain sprang from the attempts of the English merchants to prosecute an illicit trade with the Spanish Main. So this is a war between Britain and Spain started by interests in trade. These unjustifiable practices on their part produced severity on the part of the Spaniards towards the subjects of Great Britain, which were not more justifiable, because they exceeded the bounds of a just retaliation and were chargeable with inhumanity and cruelty. So basically, there was an issue with trade, and instead of handling it in a respectful way that kind of matched the infringement on the Spanish people, the Spaniards ended up attacking the people of Great Britain in a much more aggressive way, very hostile way, and, quote, inhumane is what Hamilton says. And what do you know? Once you have this one little problem, and then you respond in a more aggressive way, you get to a point where the only solution is to get more violent. The only solution is war. There's no more negotiations. He goes on to say, many of the English who were taken on the Spanish coast were sent to dig in the mines, and by the usual progress of a spirit of resentment, the innocent were, after a while, confounded with the guilty in indiscriminate punishment. The complaints of the merchants kindled a violent flame throughout the nation, which soon after broke out in the House of Commons and was communicated from that body to the ministry. Okay, so basically, right, it starts like this. The English behave badly in form of trade. The Spanish retaliate by oppressing English people and making them dig in the mines and treating them as criminals and doing some inhumane things to them. Word gets back to the people of England and they are mad. They go to their representatives, the House of Commons. The House of Commons then tells the government, it's time to go to war. We have to retaliate because the people are fired up now. The spark was lit and now it's this flame. It's unstoppable and the people want war. Letters of reprisal were granted and a war ensued, which in its consequences overthrew all the alliances that but 20 years before had been formed with sanguine expectations of the most beneficial fruits. Have we not already seen enough of the fallacy and extravagance of those idle theories which have amused us with the promises of an exemption from the imperfections, the weaknesses, and the evil incidents to society in every shape, is what Hamilton says. Have we not seen history prove that people will go to war over terrible things, even though it's in their best interest financially and for safety-wise to not do it? People will go to war over ridiculous things and bad things will happen, is what he's saying. So, what do the Anti-Federalists say, though? This is interesting, and this is where things get a little sassy. The Anti-Federalists, they hit back and they say, the other specter that has been raised to terrify and alarm the people out of the exercise of their judgment on this great occasion is the dread of our splitting into separate confederacies or republics that might become rival powers and consequently liable to mutual wars from the usual motives of contention. Then he gets a little sassy. This hobgoblin appears to have sprung from the deranged brain of Publius. So he's directly attacking Publius from the Federalist Papers. This hobgoblin appears to have sprung from the deranged brain of Publius, a New York writer who, mistaking sound for argument, has with Herculean labor accumulated myriads of unmeaning sentences and mechanically endeavored to force conviction by a torrent of misplaced words. That's quite the attack there in very fancy words, right? by the writer of this Anti-Federalist paper. He's saying it's hobgoblin, and honestly, let's look up hobgoblin really quick, you guys. Hobgoblin definition. Okay, hobgoblin is a fearsome mythical creature, according to Oxford Dictionary, but the Anti-Federalists are saying the Federalists right now are trying to scare you into supporting the Constitution, and they're doing it with unmeaning sentences and misplaced words, and they called the scare tactic a hobgoblin from a deranged brain of Publius, and that's quite the attack of a political opponent right there. Okay, so that was quite the sassy attack by the Anti-Federalists, calling the argument of the Federalists hobgoblin, basically fear-mongering and scaring people into supporting the Constitution, thinking that that's the only way we can achieve safety. Now, those are the arguments that were made, right? So the Anti-Federalists think that, first of all, it's ridiculous to assume that countries will go to war. He's basically saying that countries have incentives, especially if we were individual confederacies on American soil, if we were small entities here on American soil, we would have incentive to band together as brethren, as allied countries, because it is in our best interest. I'm with the Federalists on this, though, when I say, hello, have you seen history? It ain't looking too pretty if we think that we are going to be exempt from the behavior, the basic behavior of mankind that has been displayed dozens and dozens of times throughout human history. So I'm on the side of the Federalists on this. But I do think that the Anti-Federalist comeback of this hobgoblin from the deranged brain of Publius. I wonder if it's going to get worse from here. I mean, we're only on paper 6. Let's look at the closing statements, though, because here's where, again, we get a little more artful with the language, and we're going to see the two come at each other one last time on this topic. I guess we could start with, let's start with the Anti-Federalists, how they wrap up their paper. The Anti-Federalists say, quote, "As passing clouds obscure for a time the splendor of the sun, so do wars interrupt the welfare of mankind." So wars are pretty much, you can't avoid them. But despotism is a settled gloom that totally extinguishes happiness. The celebrated Lord Kames, whose disquisitions of human nature evidence extraordinary strength of judgment and depth of investigation, says that a continual civil war, which is the most destructive and horrible scene of human discord, is preferable to the uniformity of wretchedness and misery attendant upon despotism. Of all possible evils, as I observed in my first number, this is the worst and most to be dreaded. You guys. So I want to just bring in something quick. What is despotism? We should probably address that, because right now, the Anti-Federalists are saying they would rather have continual civil war, even though it is the worst thing that could happen in mankind, because it's much better to have civil war and the violence and badness that comes from that than to experience despotism, because they believe that despotism would be worse than civil war. Let's look at the Oxford Dictionary definition of despotism. It is the exercise of absolute power, especially in a cruel and oppressive way. So a huge argument against the Constitution by the Anti-Federalists is that they think the U.S. Constitution is basically like tyranny. It is absolute power. It would create this oppressive government that will tell everybody what to do, that will overpower the people, take their power away both at the state level and the individual level, and it would bring despotism to American soil. They were vehemently against the U.S. Constitution because they were worried that it would bring despotism, or the exercise of absolute power, is in an especially cruel and oppressive way. So when we consider that they're worried about despotism, the Anti-Federalists put their foot down here and they say, we don't care if this brings civil war. We don't care if this brings massive conflict and people die, because guess what? Human history, you're right. It shows that they fight. It shows that they go to war. It shows that people die and people suffer. But we would rather experience that and all of the possible evils than potentially bring despotism to the United States of America by ratifying the U.S. Constitution. That is aggressive, okay? So I am in favor of ratifying the U.S. Constitution. I will say that. I mean, we've had Andy Biggs on. We've had Paul Gosar. We've had members of the House Freedom Caucus, the biggest lovers of freedom in American government. And they tell us, oh, yeah, we would have voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution. And I think that's a testament to the fact that, yes, people had concerns about the size of the federal government, that they had concerns about what would come with the U.S. Constitution. And we do have problems right now as an American government. I think it's not that our Constitution failed. It's that our founders abandoned American constitutional principles and the documents itself, the rules itself. I mean, if you look at the mandates that are coming out these days, that is not constitutional at all. But it's not that our Constitution isn't working or is failed or led to despotism. It's that we don't have an enlightened public that can consent to the Constitution, and we elect leaders that don't care about the Constitution anymore, and that's a whole problem, and we've talked about that in other episodes. I think what we can see, though, after seeing almost 300 years of American history play out, it was smart for us to ratify the U.S. Constitution. But the Federalists were worried. They didn't see the big picture. They didn't see looking into the future. And they were able to say, it's too risky. We don't like this, and this looks like tyranny. But let's look at what the Federalists said to close up on this, because that was the Anti-Federalists, and I completely disagree with the Anti-Federalists on this. They're saying the long-term impact of potentially bringing despotism to American soil is way, way worse than potentially having civil war or fighting between smaller confederacies without a federal government. I disagree completely. So the Federalists say, have we not already seen enough of the fallacy and extravagance of those idle theories which have amused us with promises of an exemption from the imperfections, the weaknesses, and the evils incident to society in every shape? Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as the other inhabitants around the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue? Let the point of extreme depression to which our national dignity and credit have sunk, let the inconveniences felt everywhere from a lax and ill administration of government, let the revolt of a part of the state of North Carolina, the late menacing disturbances in Pennsylvania, and the actual insurrections and rebellions in Massachusetts declare. So far is the general sense of mankind from corresponding with the tenets of those who endeavor to lull asleep our apprehensions of discord and hostility between the states in the event of disunion, that it has from long observation of the progress of society become a sort of axiom in politics that vicinity or nearness of situation constitutes nations' natural enemies. So not only is Publius saying, listen, just because we're close doesn't mean that we're going to get along, he actually says history proves that when we're closer, we end up fighting more. When we are next to each other, when we're bordering, we end up fighting even more. So don't be so naive, Anti-Federalists. He says, an intelligent writer expresses himself on this subject to the effect, neighboring nations, says he, are naturally enemies of each other, unless their common weakness forces them to league in a confederate republic, and their constitution prevents the differences that neighborhood occasions, extinguishing that secret jealousy which disposes all states to aggrandize themselves at the expense of their neighbors. This passage, at the same time, points out the evil and suggests the remedy. And so the evil is that neighboring areas will fight with each other, will be incentivized to fight with each other because they're jealous, and it's mankind's natural tendencies, it's human nature. But the solution is to bring them together under a document of cooperation, and that would be the U.S. Constitution. So with that, you guys, I would usually give my thoughts, but I feel like I've given my thoughts throughout this episode because I am so on board with the Federalist of this, I don't even have much to say at this point. I think it's pretty clear. History has proven that not only are states that touch each other not incentivized to get along, but they will not get along, and the closer they are, they'll actually fight even more. Okay? History has proven this time and time again. I'll say it one more time. This is like us dealing with the socialists of America today. How can you look at 24 examples of socialism being tried in a country, implemented, failing, leading to massive devastation of the people, and then we still have American socialists today saying, I think if we tried it here, though, we would actually be able to make it work or something. It's ridiculous. And we tell them all the time, honey, go open up a history textbook. Back then in 1787, the Federalists were looking at the Anti-Federalists and saying, honey, look at history, open up a history textbook, because states that border each other, states that touch and don't have incentive to cooperate via a serious, legitimate document, they're not going to do it. And in fact, they're going to oppress each other. They're going to fight it out. They're going to go to war, and they're going to cause massive devastation that's not necessary. Let's encourage cooperation between the people of the United States instead of encouraging them to go to war. That being said, you guys, let's all come together like the Union. I'm not going to make that joke. I was going to be like, let's all come together the way our states did under ratification of the U.S. Constitution in December at America Fest. Let's all come together like our states did. I guess I'll do the pitch anyways. TPUSA.com/AmericaFest. I hope you guys all come and join me the way our states joined together under the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Oh yeah, baby. Join me, TPUSA.com/AmericaFest. Use code Morgan for 25% off to get to this cool country concert and speaker event with Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Brantley Gilbert. I'm so pumped, and I'm going to be there. Grandma's going out, okay? Morgan, code Morgan for 25% off, TPUSA.com/AmericaFest. I will see you there. Thanks for another awesome listening sesh and talking sesh on Federalist Paper number 6. I'll see you guys next week for another episode.